Shalom, friends. It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, here today to count with you the Omer at PJTC. Tonight after sundown, it is day 37, and we are in the week of Yesod. The word Yesod means foundation, and the word foundation can mean a lot of things. For example, I could probably use a little foundation to improve my complexion on camera, but you might also think of foundation as that hard part that holds up a house. Maybe a charitable organization of some kind, or some fundamental building blocks in, say, education that we then build higher learning on top of. In Kabbalah, this foundation is a mediating point between the heavenly attributes and the worldly realm. But I also like to think about foundation in a very personal way, that is, in terms of our origin stories. That's right, it's story time. This part of the week, I always like to share my favorite story that has to do with the attribute of the week, and this particular story is an origin story. If you're familiar with the genre of midrash, these were homiletical stories intended to interpret or explain things that appear in the Torah. These stories themselves don't appear in the Torah, but they kind of read between the lines a little bit with the same characters, maybe explaining some of the action that's going on, at least in terms of how it could best be understood about 2,000 years ago when they were written. One rabbi I know calls them Torah fan fiction, because it feels a little bit like people who are in love with the text elaborating on a text, using some of the same characters and themes while being faithful to the intention and the spirit of the text. And this particular midrash is about our forefather Abraham, or Abraham if you're a Lincolnian. And it's a midrash on the passage before we really meet Avram as the sort of chosen one by God to carry on this mission of the Jewish people. But it gives his genealogy at the end of the story of Noah. And this midrash is important in understanding who Avram was before God made him into Abraham. Because by the time we meet Avram, when God's talking to him, he's 75 years old, which some people might say is an advanced age to start a new career. So what was it about Avram that God picked him? According to the Midrash, Avram started out in his family business, which was making idols. His dad ran an idol shop, let's say, and I don't know if he would make the idols and sell them or if he was just like a middleman, but anyway, Avram worked in the idol shop as a young man. But we get an idea that he thinks that this whole idol business is ridiculous. There's a couple of times that his dad leaves him alone to run the shop and then regrets that decision. Somebody comes in to buy an idol and he's like, what do you want to buy that stupid thing for? It doesn't do anything, just sits there. Person's like, fine, I'll go to the idol shop down the street. And just to drive the point home, what Avram does is he takes a stick and he smashes all the different idols in the shop. They're made out of ceramic or something, or maybe there's some wooden ones. He takes an axe and he smashes them and just wrecks the whole thing, except for the biggest one in the shop. And this is important. The biggest one in the shop he leaves alone, but he takes a plate of flour meal and puts it in front of the biggest idol in the shop. And then he just waits for his dad to get back to the shop. His dad comes in and says, what on earth happened here? And Avram says, well, you should have seen it. Somebody came in to offer this plate of meal or whatever to the small idol over there. He points a little pile of rubble. And then the slightly bigger idol came and beat him up and took the meal, and then so on until the biggest idol smashed all the rest of the idols in the shop and then took the meal for himself. It was chaos. But the biggest idol won. And his dad looks at him and says, you're grounded. But first he says, that's ridiculous. These idols aren't beings that they can think. They can't beat up on each other. They're just dumb blocks of stone or pottery or wood or whatever. They can't actually have any impact on the real world. To which Avram says, aha. And then his dad definitely says, you're grounded. And this story is an answer to the question that the rabbis were asking, who was Avram that God would pick him? Well, he was an iconoclast, which literally means someone who destroys idols. And even though this midrash doesn't appear in the text itself, the rabbis who were part of the oral tradition back then said, this hero needs an origin story. Just like Superman comes from Krypton, Spider-Man gets bit by a spider, Avram smashes idols, and that's why he's picked to be the progenitor, the patriarch of this great innovation of monotheism and non-visible thing worshiping in the world, which was really a radical idea at the time, and it took a radical person to do it. Dude, my point is this. Every hero has an origin story. Avram has an origin story. Moses has an origin story as somebody who was born into royalty, even though he had this identity as a slave. And maybe that made him the perfect person to face up to royalty when the time came. David has an origin as a lowly shepherd boy who beats a giant, and that's what it took for him to be king. These were foundational moments in these people's lives that set them up for success later. And I'm willing to bet whatever growth you're after in this process of the Omer, whatever attribute you're trying to improve, there's something in your origin story that shows the seeds of strength. That's the rock upon which to build your future. That's why this is my favorite Yesod story, this foundational story, if you will. I'd love to hear what's your favorite origin story. Maybe there's a hero that you have from comic books or the Torah, whether it's George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and not lying about it. What's your favorite origin story about a person or an idea that you value? Put it in the Facebook group, put it in the YouTube comments, write it down in your journal, or send me an email. And don't forget to count day number 37 of the Omer after sundown tonight. And until next time, peace. Dude.